He's like, what do you want to accomplish in the next 5 years? And I said, in 5 years, I want to have your job.
Welcome to Not Another CEO podcast. I'm your host, David Politis. Every week, we talk to inspiring leaders and get the true stories, the ups and downs, the lessons learned, and come away with actionable advice for our own journeys. Today's guest is an entrepreneur, operator, and security expert who has spent much of his career protecting businesses from the evolving landscape of cyber attacks. As the co-founder and former CEO of PhishMe, he built one of the most recognized names in cybersecurity, pioneering a human-centric approach to phishing defense and security awareness training. He ultimately sold PhishMe to BlackRock for about $400 million in 2018. And since stepping down as CEO 18 months ago, he's been spending time investing in and advising growth stage companies. Please welcome co-founder and former CEO of PhishMe, Rohyt Belani.
Thank you.
I'm very excited to have you, Rohyt. First question, jump right into it. What is the one thing you did at PhishMe, big or small, that had the biggest impact and you'd absolutely do again if you're CEO of another company in the future?
That's it's an interesting one. CEOs, we try a lot of things, we do a lot of things. But my co-founder and I, we had this principle from when we started our first company together, which was the one before PhishMe. And we always said it's employees first, it's the team first, it's the people that work there. There's a couple of changes that we made, which I think had a very positive impact, much to the surprise of the naysayers. One, we said it's going to be half-day Fridays. And in the sense, it's not, you could take the day off the rest of the day, but it was no meetings for sure for anyone. And what that really did is it boosted morale because most people didn't take the half day off most of the time. They just actually got real work done without interruption. But they loved that, their manager or a client wasn't booking their time on a Friday afternoon. Sometimes people actually took the time to get a head start on their weekend, run errands. But then when they came back on Monday, they were so refreshed and so much more productive. So that's something I would definitely do again.
And did you do that from day one?
No, I wish I was that sort of a visionary. We all learn as we go along, and that took me a few years into the company. And as you know, when you're a young startup, it's all about productivity. You're working hard, 80-hour weeks. But when we had grown to about 200, 250 people, and I had a few seconds to breathe and look up and say, "Wow, we've got a company, we've got people, and I really, really need to focus a lot more on the culture of this organization." That was one of the big changes we made.
It's interesting because I'm very much of the in office, the 80 hours a week, all of that stuff. And people would always say to me, "Hey, can we have no meeting Tuesdays? Can we do this? Can we do that?" And I never really, we never really did it. We tried a couple ways, but when you talk about it on Friday specifically, and it's no meetings for the second half of the day, I think as companies get bigger, there's so many meetings actually that you almost don't have the time to think, get work done on your own. I mean, at least for leaders. I think for everyone, but for leaders, I think about my calendar, and it was full from 8 a.m. to probably 6 p.m. every day, and there's no time to actually. So and that people would complain about that, and it's an interesting time to put it because it feels like Friday. People are already starting to check out. I mean, whatever you want to say, but they're preparing for the weekend. And if they kind of have that window, when you bring that up, it's something like I feel like I would be opposed to, but then when you describe it, it kind of makes sense.
Yeah, I think as founders, we have a very skewed view of work-life balance. Naturally, that's why we're founders,
Yeah.
right? We found companies. I think the lines get blurred because work is truly our passion, and even there might be times you're grinding through it, but that passion just drives you forward. And it took me a while, I think, as a CEO to really recognize and appreciate this isn't everyone's life the way it is mine and my co-founders. And I think it's a misplaced expectation to think that they'll have the same passion Of course, these were passionate people. They were hardworking people. I'm not trying to diminish what they did for the company, but there's almost no way to replicate the passion a founder carries around for work, for the business. And I think once I was able to make peace with that, I became a better leader.
I really this one I think it's important for people to hear. A lot of first time founders that I work with, they'll say to me, why doesn't that person do X like I do X? Why doesn't that? And it's this lesson that takes a long time because you almost can't fathom that someone else doesn't care about it as much, isn't going to attack the problem the same way. And to your point, even the best performers, at the end of the day, it's not their company. And I think that is really, let me ask you, did you ever have anyone who came close, who was not a founder who came close to having that?
Yes, yes, for sure. There were people in my company that um, I would have to go the other way and say, I think it's time you took a break. You just not in a bad way. Like literally, you need a mental recycle. Just you need a break. Um, when and one thing I'll add is my co-founder and I used to talk about this a lot because when we were employees at companies in the past, one of the things he would say to me is, "But we had the same passion when we worked there." And I said, "Because we already had the founder mindset. You already have that mindset.
Hmm.
And even though you're an employee elsewhere, you are still behaving like you're an owner of the business when you're far from it." And I just again I think there's a lot of people that work very hard that are very smart and may not have that. And actually it's okay because you can slot them correctly and they can be extremely productive for the business and they can do amazing things for the company. But just recognizing that, being empathetic to people view life differently, and have a different line when it comes to work-life balance, unlike what people like you and I have.
Yeah, yes, exactly. I like that. So PhishMe, I mean, I use the product. Many of our customers use the product. Like I think everyone knew the name PhishMe, and um, but when you were starting, how did you actually get your first set of customers? 5, 10 customers? Like, was that you hand to hand combat finding those people? Was that your like? How did you get those first customers?
Absolutely, hand to hand, literally combat. Um, my co-founder and I started the business. We were fortunate for having been in the cybersecurity industry for a few years before that. We were both consultants who had done incident response work, penetration testing, all sorts of different things. So we did have people who knew of us that we had worked with that had liked our work. Uh, so we were able to get our first handful of customers by approaching people that we had worked with in the past and just present to them what we were thinking, what we were doing. Some of these folks were working at Fortune 5 companies, and literally our first enterprise sale was to a Fortune 5 company. It was very daunting because while we were very excited, it was an extremely daunting customer to have saying, "Wow, we're actually now going to have to run phishing exercises for this customer globally for an employee base of 300,000 employees spread all over the globe, different cultures, different languages, different time zones." Um, yeah, so I think the first 5 or so, I would say, were from our Rolodex of contacts. The word of mouth started getting around a little bit, uh, but we just pounded the pavement. We went to trade shows and conferences and just spoke at every venue we could get. I went to every ISSA meeting around the country that I could speak at. I mean, I think there was one year where I did 25 speaking engagements just at ISSA chapter meetings in one year. So every 2 weeks I was at somewhere and people were like, "What's up with this guy?" Uh, but I think that's founders really have to own the go to market, the sales process for a long time. And I think that's a mistake some founders make where, especially these days where it's a little easier to get funded in the early stages, where they go, "Oh, great, let me hire a VP of sales, light sales on fire." And then they sort of get disconnected from the real customer challenges. And when you're making product decisions, you're not going to make the best decisions. So yeah, I was very involved, I would say, in getting the first 100 customers for PhishMe. And even after that, as we scaled, of course, you got to let people do what they have to. But the team knew they could always rely on my co-founder and me and just call us into any sales meeting and we would be there.
You know, what's interesting is I think that especially for technical founders, I was actually interviewing someone for another episode, and technical founder, and we had this whole conversation about how for technical founders being out there, being the face of the company, can be very difficult. And so to your point, I see this. They raise money, and one of the first hires that they have on their thing is a VP of sales. They haven't even sold, they sold 2 customers to 5 customers, and they already are hiring a VP of sales who's been a VP of sales at a company doing 50 million of ARR, and I think that this part of the founder doing those first set of sales, you can't replicate that. And it also allows you to then be successful at hiring someone because you know what you need to hire for.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think also as a company, even when we were 50 million ARR, but we're growing and going into a new geography, set up an office in the Middle East or in Australia, it's really important, I thought, for me as a CEO and a founder to be there for it's sort of rinse and repeat. The first 5 customers in that geography are going to be very different than the first 5 we had in the US. Their wants are going to be different, and being there and hearing it firsthand and understanding the hurdles that the sales team has to deal with, you can really take that back and say, okay, what can we do to iron this stuff out and make it really easy so it can get as close to scripted as possible. But if you do that too soon, to your point, I think you fall flat. The passion doesn't come through. Last thing I'll say on this point is it's also important for the clients and the customers to see that the founders really care, they're involved, they're there, they're listening, and not sort of taking an ivory tower approach.
Yeah, it's I remember distinctly getting on a call with a customer one time, and they said, "You're the founder?"
Mhm.
I said, "Yeah, I'm the founder." Like, who I don't, I'm not nothing special. I'm like, "Yeah, I'm the founder." They said, "Oh, none of our vendors, like, does the founder get on with me?"
Right.
And this was like a director of IT. And I remember that distinctly sticking with me, that told me, to your point, being there and being involved and showing that's a competitive advantage for you in the sales process.
Absolutely. It's an interesting anecdote. We were trying to crack open the Japanese market, and I flew out to Japan in 2018. Um, I won't get into the details of that journey there because I had missed connections and delayed flights. So it took, 36 hours later there and 4 flight segments, I get to Japan. I've got a translator translating everything I'm saying, et cetera, et cetera. I get to this meeting and I had 3 people actually with me at the meeting. One was our Japanese salesperson, and there was another person from the US and one from Australia who had come out there because the Australian was overseeing the Asia Pacific region. Um, as it just turned out, age-wise, I was the youngest of the 4 of us. And the Japanese culture, it's interesting. A lot of Asian cultures, there's a lot of weight given to age as a sign of respect and so on. So we walked into the first meeting, and there was the whole ceremony to exchange business cards. Now, before the people actually got to read the business card, I noticed that they were almost not establishing eye contact with me, and they were only talking to the guy amongst the 4 of us that looked the oldest. And I was almost viewed as this guy must be a sales engineer or whatever. We don't need to talk to him. And the moment the guy got my business card, he looked at it. He looked up and he said to me in his Japanese accent, "You're the CEO?" I said, "Damn." And after that, he only looked at me. So again, culturally, I think it's also very important that they see, it's really you're important because you are, and I'm here for you.
I want to go back to the Fortune 5 customer because that's scary. I mean, when you tell, I have anxiety now listening to you talk about that. I mean, did you want that sounds like a stupid question, but now, like, for me reflecting, I'm not sure I would want the Fortune 5 customer, like, early days. Did you want that customer, or that just happened in your lap and then that was what you had?
I don't think it just happened. It was I think I was quite a foolish 30-something-year-old at the time. And I kind of looked at it, said, I'm going to get whatever customers I can. And it used to freak
Mm.
my co-founder out because he was the CTO. So it was his job to make sure that our software is up and running and it was accessible and worked the way it's supposed to be promised it to work. Interesting story. When we sold this Fortune 5, at the time, vendor management questionnaires were a lot lighter than they are today. We weren't have gotten through at that time because literally the server we were running on sat in my co-founder's living room behind his TV. And I remember I was visiting Northern Virginia where he lived once, and his wife, my co-founder's Aaron, his wife said to me, you know, I know when customer X, the Fortune 5, is actually running a phishing campaign. I said, how's that? She's like, because the plates start spinning. I can hear it. I can't hear my TV show.
Oh my God.
Yeah, yeah. It was
But you
interesting
delivered
start.
for that customer,
We
right?
we did, and the customer actually continued to stay a customer of PhishMe till I actually stepped down, and they probably still are. So it was at least a decade. And so if you look at customer long-term value, it was a tremendous proposition.
Wow. Um, I want to talk a little bit about fundraising. From my understanding and what I've read in our conversations, you were efficient. You really thought about efficiency in times that it didn't matter. We go through cycles, but you thought about efficiency and it was important. But you also did fundraise.
Right.
And you want to talk maybe a little bit about that?
Yeah. We both my co-founder and I came out of being consultants. So we ran a consulting company prior to that, and we almost had to teach ourselves how to run a product company. We were really focused on operational margins because that's what you do, operating margins, because that's what you do as a services company. And it took us a while to figure out, okay, as a product company, you are going to invest. You're going to be in the red maybe for a little bit till you start getting revenues to compensate for what you invested. We got our first 20 customers completely bootstrapped. We got to about $2.5 million in ARR without taking a dime of outside capital. At which point, we saw our first competitor showing up in the market that was behind us. They hadn't yet really gotten a customer. We were starting to see what a successful sales motion looked like after getting these 20 customers. We knew we had product market fit for this version and really said, well, if we're able to raise a little bit of capital now, this is a good time to get maybe 3 or 4 salespeople. Again, not this big organization, 3 or 4 salespeople, and also add to our engineering team so we can accelerate R&D because we've heard from the market what they're looking for next in our product. And so we went out and raised a small $2.5 million round at that point. It was challenging, even though the metrics were really positive for us. As I just said, I had to knock on a lot of doors, had a lot of them slammed on me. I was told I was stupid. Our idea made no sense. It wasn't scalable. The TAM wasn't large enough. The usual things. And I don't blame any of those investors because I look back and say, you know, could I have said that if I were in their shoes? Probably. It could have, it's possible. Um, but we got lucky. We got one investor who said yes. They came in, and then things got progressively easier as success started showing up in our numbers and metrics. So when we went in to raise our Series B a couple of years down the line, we had 4 competing term sheets. So we were able to get a little bit of a bidding war and some really competitive terms for ourselves. And then when I raised the Series C for the company a year and a half after that, or 2 years after that, we had 9 competing term sheets at this point.
Wow.
So it was almost an exponential increase in the number of investors that were getting interested. And so I would say to any founders out there, don't give up. Like, yes, it is really hard to raise capital. You hear all these positive stories of people raising at ridiculous valuations and they're hitting tech crunch all the time. It's not the norm. It's a damn hard process.
Yeah, you hear it's like self-selection, the people, those stories, and it's about they raised, they raised in 3 days and they raised 50 million, at this, and it's like it's not the 99% of fundraising processes are not that, you know. How many investors you think you spoke to for the first round? How many investors before you found that one?
It was over 100 for the first one.
Wow.
Yeah, over 100. I was just so focused on that. I went out to Silicon Valley in Boston. I live in New York, so New York was easy for me. But I was out in the DC area, Boston, and the Valley for 3 months. I was out all the time in one of these places, just talking to investors, um, sort of begging them to put money into the company. And, it finally worked. We got an investor out of the DC area. It was great. And we were able to use that capital quite efficiently because when we went out to raise our Series B, we had by then grown from being a 2.5 million ARR company to a 14 million ARR company. So it was a rapid jump. We went from 2.5 to 7 to 12 and a half, 4, and then a few months down the line, 14. So it was just over 2 years. So it was very quick. And that's why, now I had to speak to only about 10 investors and we got 4 term sheets. So it went from over 100 to get one. The yield increased substantially. And then the last round, honestly, it was unsolicited. We started getting term sheets coming in and I'm like, this might be a good time to raise. I was going to wait 6 months, but when people are coming knocking at your door and you have the leverage, it might be a good time.
When you were getting the no's from people in the early round, did you pivot the story to fit what the investors basically kind of were asking for? Or did you keep the story and essentially that one investor is the one who believed the story? You know what I'm trying? I don't know if
No, I totally get it. I think it's really important, I would say to folks that one of the lessons I learned is I always demonstrated to potential investors and my existing investors and board that I am married to the problem at hand that we're trying to solve constantly. I'm not necessarily married to the solution as I think of it today, because that may have to evolve. The tech landscape may change. The competitive landscape will change. There could be a number of factors. We will get customer feedback. And I think that served me really well in the fundraising process, where that ounce of humility where you say, yes, I'm confident this is a problem with a large addressable market. I'm also confident that today we have a product that fits the bill, but we
Hmm.
can be quite flexible based on what we hear and what we observe to pivot or change direction as needed. We're not going to say, okay, hey, we're leaving phishing and we're going to start developing authentication software now. But,
Yeah, right.
the way we tackle the phishing problem might have to evolve. And honestly, we actually did. We followed suit and we did evolve. Through the life of PhishMe, we started off as a phishing simulation software. We had one product. By the time we sold to the private equity folks, we had 4 products. And actually, some of the newer products were already at 4 times the average sale price of the phishing simulator product. The growth rates were 3 times that of PhishMe. And so it was when we saw the opportunity, we said, we just got to jump in. Of course, it was very
Hmm.
adjacent. The pieces fit together, but we had to change focus along the way.
Hmm. I want to actually keep going on this because on the product side, um, it is hard when you're growing that fast and everything, like to make the call for the next product, from your core product to the second product. It's, I'd say, pretty high risk. You got to make a big investment. You got to evolve your marketing and your sales and everything. Um, who was the ultimate person driving that? Was it you in the weeds on the product and with the customers and everything? Your co-founder, where um, and how long did it take? What was the second product? How long did it take? Can you talk me through that? Because I feel like going from single to multi-product, like that evolution is it's risky, expensive, risky, and if it works, game changing. If it doesn't work, that can set you back.
Absolutely. So the story is, I'd say necessity, as they say, is the mother of invention. So I'd give credit to necessity more than myself or my co-founder for starters. So what happened was we had about 200 customers globally now running phishing simulations using PhishMe. These are mostly large enterprise customers with 10,000 plus employees each, large organizations. what a lot of them started telling us was that they were experiencing a negative side effect in that when simulations were sent to them, or if they saw otherwise suspicious emails in their inbox, they would pick up the phone, and we're talking many years ago, or email help desk and say, "Hey guys, I see this suspicious email. What do you want me to do?" The help desk folks weren't trained to handle this. They said, "What the heck? Who's creating this extra work for me?" And so it happened enough where they went and complained to their higher ups, who then went to the head of security and CISO and said, "Shut this nonsense down. Like, this is creating work. It's impacting productivity. We got to stop these phishing simulations." So we heard this feedback and we just had to react very quickly. And we said, you know what? Let's just streamline this very quickly for our customers. And we developed a plugin for Outlook that allowed our customers, as employees, to click that button if they saw a suspicious email and do nothing else. So it would package up the email, the headers, and it would send it to a pre-designated inbox. And then whoever was supposed to look at it could get there in due course and do what they had to with it. So we took that problem away. And as we did that, we realized we've created another problem, but one we can monetize, which is now the cybersecurity team started digging into this inbox and said, once in a while we find an actual attack that got through all our defenses that's in here. But the problem is finding the needle in the haystack takes a long time and a lot of people. And so we need help. And the moment we heard the little inkling of an opportunity there, I remember I went to my co-founder. I said, we need to develop a product to triage this stuff for them. When this inbox is full, to triage it. And he said, And we called the concept triage. Eventually, the product was called triage. And the whole idea was that the product would suck in the emails from this inbox, do a whole bunch of automated analysis. We're talking the pre-Gen AI and LLM era. So it was heavy lifting for the engineers, do a lot of automated analysis, and then really bring you down to saying, look, there might have been 20,000 emails sitting in this inbox of hell. We've brought it down to 10 clusters because we've clustered similar emails. So we've brought it down to 10 clusters that really matter. We've assigned weights based on certain criteria. Now you can have a look at it, and we would help the customers find a lot of real attacks that had gotten through on a daily basis. So now this value proposition of the company and our solution went from, oh, you train our people and we're reducing risk, to, wow, you're actually leveraging that knowledge to help us identify real attacks. And that's where we were able to get massive ASP expansion. This is where we said, if you were paying, I'm making it up, $50,000 for a PhishMe license annually, you're going to pay $150,000 for triage, because this is stopping real bad. And the market was there for it. So we worked on that. So as I said, I think keeping our ear to the ground and listening to the customers, listening to the market, help us drive that. Now I'll round that part out by saying what we then got better at is anticipating what the customer is going to ask for next. We now got better at that. And we realized that we had gone from being, with PhishMe, the simulation solution, we were like a physician. If I had to use a medical metaphor, saying, I'm going to give you your vitamins and tell you to get on the treadmill 4 times a week, We're giving you this hygiene, cyber hygiene, right? And live a healthy life. Now we got in the business of, hey, we run MRIs and we run the right scans and we tell you where there are problems in your body. But what we were not solving for them was, hey, you told me there's, these 150 bad emails sitting there. Can you just surgically remove these? Like, what do I do now? Because the process at the time was the cybersecurity team would have to go beg someone in the mail team, hey, I found these, can you do it? It was not an efficient, effective process. So we actually developed software to say, not only can we help you identify what was reported as bad, but once we know something was reported, we can go look in your mail servers and say, show me anything that's similar to this. And give you the opportunity to say, go quarantine all this bad stuff. And actually, then we took it a step further and said, if any one of our customers finds something that's particularly bad, that intelligence should propagate to every other customer. The network effect started creeping in. And the moment we got that, that's when the hockey stick curve hit. Because as we all know, when a customer benefits by not just using your software, but being part of the network,
yes,
it's magical. because customers would just say to me, like, I show up to work in the morning and there's already 120 emails that were quarantined that had gotten through our defenses. I had to do nothing. You just took care of
Mm.
it for me. These would have been 120 potential compromises that you just avoided for us today. So, long-winded way of saying, initial concept was something we developed, then we kept our ear to the ground, and then we got really good at anticipating what the next thing would be.
Hmm. And back to the point of how when we were talking about investors, you were focused on this problem area. You knew that this was the problem area. You lived in the problem area. You acquired the customers, hundreds of them, and those customers basically told you where to take, in the beginning at least, they told you where to take the product and how to evolve it. But it was because you lived in that area and were the experts and people, you had those communication lines open, that you were able to navigate to where you did.
Yeah, it's interesting. So we eventually, for our product managers, we would weigh, salespeople will listen to one customer and say, "Hey, you should develop this." A marketing person thinks something, right? It's always chaotic, but you want to take everyone's viewpoint in. And so we, like most companies, we developed some method around the madness, and there were capabilities that we would weigh based on what existing important customers that were asking for, and we would literally weigh that by their contract values and look at cumulatively how much contract value would be at risk for retention if
Mm.
we didn't develop a certain capability. We would also, there was the constant, fixing tech debt and bugs and so on that was happening. But then interestingly enough, I think what's really important also is that you don't want to turn into a contract software development shop for your customers, right? You have to keep the innovation at the company alive as well. And so we had a slot in the roadmap to say we will always develop features which would be driven by the CTO's office, my co-founder, who's
Mm.
keeping his ear on the ground, not just listening to customers, but we had an intelligence team that was watching real attacks in motion. What are the real bad guys doing? How are they circumventing today's controls? And they would bring in saying, we might not have been asked for this yet because maybe our customers haven't experienced it, but we think this is where the puck's headed to next. And I think it's
Mm.
important to always have that in mind, to say a part of you has to always be skating to where the puck's headed, but you also got to make sure if you're standing somewhere and someone gave you the puck, you got to hit it, take a shot at the goal. So it's a fine balance between the two.
You've talked about these enterprise accounts, and you've talked about even how you're doing this based on ARR or whatever. Did you have a very defined ICP, ideal customer profile?
I think it's very important to constantly be thinking about what your ICP is. It over time, as we evolved products, of course, the ICP evolved as well. As we entered different markets, we went downstream as well. So we were purely enterprise. We started serving mid-market. But yes, at any given point in time, we always had our eye on the ball in regards to the ICP. I think it's extremely important to get alignment across product marketing, the direction of product, engineers understanding why they're doing something. I think to the success of the business. At the end of the day, look, there's probably 100 good ideas for any given product. And you have to be able to whittle it down to say, what are the 3 things we're doing over the next 3 to 6 months? And
Mm-hmm.
how do you get there? Because you have to put that customer focus on and say, what really matters to our customer? And if you don't know who your ideal customer is, how are you going to do that?
Mm-hmm. I want to go back to the consulting piece that you talked about, going from consulting services business to a product company. Can you talk maybe more about what were the differences that you experienced? If you had to say the top 3 differences, you talked a little bit about margin but like, I want to say first, like, I believe personally, I think people who come out of services industries around the space and to start product companies, my experience has been that the product piece is usually pretty good product market fit, because they only were doing it probably because they had some experience with it in the services side of their business or whatever. Um, but you see a lot fail, and when you get into it, it's because that CEO can't transition from service. So can you share your experience of making that transition and the top things that you think you had to learn or that were challenging for you.
Yeah, it is. It is a challenge, as you called out. There's substantial differences. I would say the ethos of capital efficiency is a positive that spilled over from being someone running a services company into running a product company. And that's why we were able to do things in a very capital efficient manner. Not, a lot of product only founders and CEOs that have never been part of services have this mindset of let's raise a pre-seed round, we do something, let's raise a seed round. Let's get capital first. And our thinking always was, can we do this without capital to get to a certain place? So we have to take on less capital, dilute less of the company. And so we had this stingy mindset, which actually worked for the entire employee base, because when we sold the company, we minted many first-time millionaires, and that to me was a success criteria for myself. While my investors that we had, they did very well. I was very happy about that. But it was also looking at employees whose lives changed financially, and to me, that was success. I was like, this is why we do this. Um, but the challenges that you talked about there is being the stingy, which could help, but if it goes too far, it can hurt you. Right. And because you do need to know, in a product company, scale matters. In a services business, you can stay small and say, look, I do something very specialized. We do some very high-end services. I'm going to bill a higher rate for it. And I think you can have a great lifestyle business. People can make a lot of money doing that. But for most product businesses, if you just if you think in a lifestyle way in technology, you're probably going to be obsolete at some point. You have to have much more of a growth mindset to say you have to be constantly innovating and growing. And you have to have sort of your eye on the ball to say size matters as a product company. So you have to say, how do I get to a critical mass where either I'm an IPO ready company, or I'm daunting enough to a large competitor where they go, I want to gobble these guys up. They're a pain in my rear end, right? So it's you have to have that growth mindset. So we had to unshackle Aaron and I from that services mindset a little bit. And when we raised the first round, I remember him asking me, he's like, wow, you really want to get this $2.5 million into the business, And I was like, Aaron, I know it's kind of scary. Like they just cut us a check. They believe in what we're doing, and we're going to now start spending this. And over the next 9 to 12 months, there might not be a lot to show in return because we're in investing phase. But, again, if we do it the right way, if we're judicious, if we're understanding how we're allocating capital, we're constantly looking at the unit economics, even when we're not profitable, saying, hey, we ran this marketing campaign. What was the customer acquisition cost from that one versus this? Do some A/B testing. Don't just go all in immediately. If we do this the right way, I think the investors are going to look at it and say, wow, these guys are being smart with our capital. And I think good things will happen. And knock on wood, they did. So we had to transition into that mindset, but also really, really be careful. We could have gotten really carried away because, when we had those 9 term sheets of the Series C, one of the investors who we politely declined said to me, you're raising a $40 million round. Why don't you just make it 50 and let me come in? And it's very
I've
flattering.
heard those. I've heard.
Right. It's very flattering. You're saying like someone's just willing to give you an additional $10 million, but it's not for free, right? You're giving part of the company away and you're constantly evaluating, is it worth it? Can I judiciously deploy this capital to increase the value of the company enough to justify taking on this additional capital, both for the management team, the employees, but also my existing investors who I have a fiduciary responsibility to? And that was the tightrope. And we really had to evolve from the lifestyle consulting company mindset to the scaling product company.
That balance is very hard. Your point is a good one. Like, it's good to be cheap, but with a product company, if you're too cheap, because you need to see the revenue before you invest in the product. Like in some businesses, that's possible. In some product businesses, in most, you have to invest into the product to actually drive that growth and that revenue.
You asked me for 2 or 3 things. And one of the other things I saw, which was very different, when we were a services company, we were able to be quite localized in that, our main office was in New York City. We served a lot of the Wall Street banks in New York as customers. We served pharmaceuticals and telecom companies in New Jersey. And there was not really much of a need, like given our size, we had plenty of business, with these large companies around us. We didn't really need to say, hey, we need to open a London office or a Dubai office. Just, you didn't need to do that. The risk reward just wasn't there. We weren't large enough to say we've got this ridiculous amount of additional capital that we can risk to do that. And things were fine. But as a product company, especially one when you're in a competitive environment, which you're inevitably going to be in once
Mhm.
things start looking good, you're always trying to think one step ahead and say, what are my growth levers here, right? Where is growth coming from? Is it coming from product expansion? Is it coming from geographic expansion? Am I increasing price? Where is this coming from? And so geographic expansion is pretty natural for a lot of technology companies. And I'll say, we learned also over time how to be more and more capital efficient with that, because you brought it up earlier in the conversation. These sorts of things are risky. It needs a lot of money to crack open a new geography. You have to hire a unit of people that will work. You can't have one person there. You have a salesperson, you have a sales engineer, you got customer support. Before you know it, now you have an HR person there, someone, managing the office. Before you know it, it's like there's 8 people in this office. We don't have revenue here. We're subsidizing it with our revenue from the US. And so we really had to think through those things. But again, we got good at analyzing geographies, getting 2 or 3 marquee customers before really putting too much capital down, understanding what the market wanted, and de-risking the situation and going in there. But again, that was a mindset I had to learn and develop.
I obviously, like everyone building this kind of a business, you've had a lot of ups and downs, a lot of challenges. I ask every guest this question, which is, what is the biggest challenge you ever faced at PhishMe, and how did you overcome that challenge?
A lot of people have to think of that answer. I don't. It's so unfortunately in 2018, right after we sold to, it was actually 2 private equity firms. BlackRock was one of them, and there was another one based out of Boston that was the primary investor, and these two acquired a majority stake in the company. A month after the acquisition was complete and announced, and everyone was excited, the U.S. government has an arm called CFIUS that some of you may have heard, which is the Center for Foreign Investment in the U.S. It's the same one that's looking at ByteDance, the guys behind TikTok, and so on. So when there's Chinese money or Russian money, etc., coming in, and there's potential national security implications, the government, rightly so, looks at that and says, should this be allowed? And we got someone from CFIUS reaching out saying, we need to talk to you guys. And I was a little confused because we had a Boston-based private equity firm, and we had BlackRock, which is as red, white, and blue as you can get. And I'm thinking to myself, why do they want to talk to me? One thing led to the next, and what they claimed is that one of the LPs, the investors in the Boston-based firm, was a rich Russian gentleman, and that they were concerned that there would be undue influence exerted on us to do things that were in the detriment of national security. Candidly, I thought it was a little stretched and far-reaching in the creative in the thinking process. But look, we had to comply. One thing led to the next. They opened an investigation not into us, but into that private equity firm for their investment in us. So we were sort of collateral damage, dragged through the mud. And it was very challenging because for 2 years, we were hitting the news for all the wrong reasons. We were in the Wall Street Journal, where people thought, the way articles were written, that we were somehow some sort of Russian agents operating this company here. And it was devastating. It was a business that was growing 70% per annum for 6 years straight, and now we had to switch into survival mode because we had a lot of customers saying, I just want to cancel my subscription. I don't want to be associated with the Russian entity. And every morning I just wake up, my sales team would provide me a list of accounts that were it was an apology tour. Sorry, what can I do to hold you on here? I had to throw everything they tell you in how to run a subscription business out of the window and get creative. But what I'm very proud of is I hung in there with my entire management team. No one from my management team abandoned us. We all stuck together, and we said, we are going to fight this because we know we're not wrong. We've done nothing wrong to deserve this. And so it was 2.5 years of fighting. And, without saying too much, when the government is investing you under the national security umbrella, a lot of the rules of democracy go out the window. And so it was extremely challenging because you could not have a rational legal conversation. It feels quite dictatorial at that point. And so we had to deal with this, but I'm very proud we got out of it. We got a clean bill of health, no wrongdoing. Of course, along the way, the government required that investor divest their share, which, whether we agree with it or not, was painful because now it was distracting us as the management team to do those things. So that 2.5 years was extremely challenging. But what I will say, we built a lot of character, and then we needed that character for the next 2 years because we had to rebuild the business now. It was almost like a hurricane had ripped through a town that was thriving. And we had to rebuild the business. We had lost a lot of good talent in the ranks below the executive management team. So we had to rehire, explain to people what had happened. We're not Russian agents, and it took a while. It took 2 years to bring it back to growth. And I was very happy to see we were able to do that. We were able to make an acquisition of a company in Israel, and we really got back to humming growth 2 years after that. And that's sort of when I decided that it's time to transition, hand the reins to someone else to take it to the next step because I was quite exhausted.
Wow. As I ask everyone this story, that one has to be up there. And I can't even, um, I can't even imagine, like, for 2 years, and not to lose any of the management team or anything. Like, that's like getting punched in the face literally daily, probably for 2 years.
Multiple times a day.
I mean, it's amazing. So you stepped down for good reason, and I'm sure you were very exhausted. Um, what are you doing now since you've stepped back from operating day to day?
Yeah, I would say, the exhausted is part of it, but I also did want to spend some time with my family, who'd been very patient with me for 20 years while I built my career. So I decided to, spend more time, hang out with the children a bit more. So that's been great. But professionally, I think in addition to just having fun personally, it's I have to keep myself intellectually stimulated. That's part of the personality. So what I've been doing for the last 18 months, I've been very fortunate to have had some investors and some CEOs reach out to me saying, can you be an advisor to us? It's either in a capacity as a short-term engagement for a particular problem they're dealing with to help them, or they're looking to crack open a geography. Can you help us? How do we think about go-to-market in the Middle East? Or in some cases, it's can you join the board of directors of this company and just be alongside us for this journey? So I feel very fortunate to have had a whole barrage of opportunities that have come my way. I've been able to be a little selective there and actually pick and choose the ones that I think I'll be really excited about and want to work with those teams. So that's I've been doing some of that. I've also been working with some nonprofits, which has been very rewarding. It's not something I had any time to do prior to that. So I think at this point I'm living a little more balanced life than I was for 20 years. But that's not to say that somewhere down the line I won't jump back in and try to start something again. I don't know if and when that'll happen, but for now things are good in this capacity. So I feel more like a coach than the player now.
Hmm. What did you always know that you wanted to be an entrepreneur?
I would say I knew pretty early on. I was pretty young when I um, decided that I wanted to get out on my own and do something by myself. This is while I was growing up in India. When I was really young, my dad is a doctor, and he had just started his practice, and it takes a while for doctors to establish their practice. So I had a humble beginning to my life financially, but and then I saw my dad's entrepreneurial energy as a doctor who set up his own practice. And I said, oh, wow, like if you sort of try to control your own destiny, magic happens. So I always had that in the back of my mind. When I came to the US, it was really more a matter of, I say to people, I worked jobs. It worked out well because I got amazing experience and I understood the industry. But at the time, I did it purely because I could not start a company legally till I got a green card. So I had to be on work visas. That was the only thing holding me back.
Did your father tell you anything explicit? Like, did he tell you you should be an entrepreneur when you grow up? Did you get any of that, or it was just from watching him, like, through osmosis?
Yeah, it was my father. It was my grandfather who was also a doctor and sort of had his own practice and so on. No, I think it was osmosis. I was fortunate. My parents gave me pretty free reign on my career. Unlike a lot of Asian parents where, you have the quintessential tiger mom and dad. I didn't have that.
Yeah, yeah.
I was fortunate not to have that. They gave me free reign. I returned it with academic success, which bolstered their trust in that I was up to good things. And so they always supported me in what I wanted to do, but they never explicitly said, "Hey, you should do this or that." In fact, funny story, like when I thought about starting my first company, I remember I called my dad and actually I think he said to me, he said, you're telling me you have an offer from a big four consulting company to come in and be a senior manager there at age 27, and they're telling you you'll make partner before you're 30, and you're turning that down to go start something yourself. You really need to think hard about this one. And so it was almost the other way. It was almost like you've got some really good things going on there. Why aren't you thinking about?
How do they feel now about?
Yeah, they're obviously they're proud and happy the way it's turned out. Um, yeah, I think it's hard to imagine when you start a business yourself to imagine what really will be. We all hope for these dream exits or what have you, right? But there's still days I wake up and I pinch myself. I'm like, is this real? Is this life? Is this what happened? I feel so fortunate that to have truly lived the American dream. I'm, and I say this to my cousins who were born in the U.S. and grew up here, and I say, you don't know how good you have it. We sit here and are critical of the country and all of that, but I don't say this just for the heck of it. This is truly the greatest country on the planet. If you have an innovative streak to you and you want to do something entrepreneurial, there is no place on the planet like this one.
I agree with that. What now you mentioned you're now a coach. Did you have a coach? Did you have a mentor, coach, advisor, that someone that really kind of changed your trajectory?
Yeah, not in a formal way where I went to someone and said, "Hey, will you be my mentor?" But I think I was also very fortunate in that I had three independent board members at PhishMe, all of whom were successful entrepreneurs, and so could really empathize, even sympathize with the way you're feeling, what you're going through, um, and they were always available for me to have very candid conversations about the challenges, the struggles, and in a way, so there were three of them. They had different expertise in different areas. So I would call them depending on what I wanted to talk about. So I think I got very lucky. I had three mentors in that way.
Hmm. Um, when you think about your entire experience that you've had up to this point, your whole career, if you could go back and give yourself one piece of advice, before you started your first job ever, what would that piece of advice be?
Yeah, it's a hard one. Normally people are like, "Oh, I would go tell my younger self to work harder, etc." No, I worked damn hard when I was young. I don't know. It would be like, "Hey, you should have enjoyed your 20s and 30s a little more." I feel like that was a blur in my life. All I did was focus on my professional life. Period. Now I can't complain about that because I am bearing the fruit of that, and so I really can't complain about that. But I would say, on a serious note, I would go back and say, be a little more patient. I think I was very impatient in my 20s and 30s, sometimes to my detriment. Sometimes it worked for me. I remember the first promotion I got. I was working at the company only for a year. I was 24 years old. I went to my boss's office. It was my performance review. And I remember saying to him, he said, "So how's the year gone?" And he was obviously a director. I was an entry level consultant. He's like, "What do you want to accomplish in the next 5 years?" And I said, "In 5 years, I want to have your job," is what I said to him. And yeah, it was clearly not politically correct and very impatient. But fortunately, he was a really nice guy. He understood where I was coming from. Didn't mean it in the literal sense, but understood that I wanted to rise to his ranks in 5 years. Um, and even as an early CEO, as we talked a little bit about in the beginning, I was quite impatient, not being able to understand why people didn't share the same level of urgency and passion and wanting to kill themselves for working here and so on and so forth. But I just feel like once I was able to mature a little bit as a CEO, understand people better, imbibe and get some of that patient mentality, it actually helped the organization get more productive because people were less on tenterhooks. They were calmer, they were more secure. Not that we were like, hey, you can get away with murder, but it just made people more confident and focused on versus what do I need to do to make sure that these guys know I'm working hard.
Yeah, that's really good advice. I actually think I had the same. I could have used that advice myself, when you say it like that. In the beginning, especially if you have that drive and that kind of energy and everything, you are very impatient. And I think that in one way it's good, right? Because it is what separates you from the masses, quote unquote. But it's also, you almost need to know how to use that energy, because I remember my first boss ever was like, Dave, you got to chill out. Like, you're like on me. Like, he'd be like, do this thing. And like 5 minutes later, I'd be like, here it is. Can you look at it? He's like, okay, man, you got to chill out a little bit. And so there is the good to it, but that patience is also important. If people want to get in touch with you, if people may want to hear more or talk to you about being an advisor, what is the best avenue for them to do that? Email, LinkedIn,
Both
something
those, I
else?
look at LinkedIn regularly as well. LinkedIn's easy, so just hit me up on LinkedIn, and I try to be very responsive to people. I am mentoring some grad students at Carnegie Mellon as well who are interested in entrepreneurship because I advise the dean of the College of Engineering there, and it's just I enjoy in my little way giving back, and I always, to your point, think I benefited from having mentors, and I need to give back and be one as well.
Well, thank you. This is a big way of giving back, and I appreciate you doing this with me. And I think there's a lot of good nuggets in here for people to hear, and also the truth. I mean, the truth of the ups and downs and the challenges. And so thank you very much for sharing
No,
all of
well,
this
thank
today.
you for having me. Thank you.
This is great. Well, hopefully everyone enjoyed. If you enjoyed it, please share this with your networks. And we'll see you for the next episode of Not Another CEO Podcast. That's a wrap for this week's episode of Not Another CEO Podcast. Thanks for joining. For show notes and more, please visit notanotherceopodcast.com. We'll see you next week.